Prof, pwede ba kayong mag-ayos nito? Parang ang dami na naming binato doon sa eksena. Ikaw nga mag-compose nito.
Kumbaga sa Mahjong
Ano bang basa mo dito?
Well, I mean, first of all, surprise, surprise, no? It's not like hindi tayo sanay sa ganitong klase ng politika, especially in the final stretch, no? So pumapasok na tayo sa final stretch of the race. And I think this is where makikita na natin saan tataya, no? Yung mga ating mga politiko, saan mga tao. And then also dito nakikita natin na lubos yung pagbigay ng suporta, especially mga volunteers, no? Yung passionate base ng iba't ibang candidates. We kind of clearly see that with the side, for instance, of Vice President Leni Robredo, na grabe yung mga dami nilang grand rallies, ang dami mga volunteers na lumalabas from the north to the south, from Davao, Isabela, Caloocan, Pasig, etc. But also, of course, ito rin, nakikita natin yung epekto na yung absence ng real political parties sa Philippines at saka yung walang clear ideological fault line. So nakikita natin there are people are okay with Sara Duterte as their vice presidential candidate, but they kind of like someone else as their presidential candidate. Whether may Rosa, may Isa, whether with Isko, with Lenin, or of course the unity with Bongo Marcos. And the last thing I want to emphasize just for our discussion, just to get the ball started, is dito rin nakikita natin na may parang may gap because the survey suggests that we have a very, very clear front runner in ways that we haven't had in a long time. And yet, pag titignan mo naman yung alignments or realignments at saka yung kaguluhan, parang it doesn't reflect it because we see a lot of survivalist, traditional politicians.
Exactly. Kasi
they're not going with the front runner. They're going against the front runner. So this is what's really interesting to me.
In other words, sinasabi nyo, Prof, na hindi naman niyang kakampi ng basta-basta lang. Hindi naman niyang kakampi ng basta-bastang prinsipyo lang. Siyempre naman, meron niyang kalkulasyon.
Exactly. I mean, believe ako sa mga politiko pagdating na reading the pulse of the people. Siyempre, mga survivalist ang mga politiko sa ating bansa kasi wala nga real political parties. And it's really about, parang magaganong ka, where's the wind going?
Reading the wind.
Teka. So, yeah, one more one, no? You were saying, no, na hindi ka na surpresa. So, let's talk about yung kay Alvarez na biglang, di ba, biglang tinalikuran si Ping Lacson at pumanig kay Leni. Ano yun? Was that a move in favor of the flow of people now, of supporters for Leni? Yun ba yun? Clearly.
Yeah, so for instance, yung let's just call it this way, disintegration of the supposed admin side, no? On one hand, meron tayong mga tao na for instance, Representative Salceda and then a number of people from Cagayan de Oro and Mindanao. Ito yung mga tao na hindi komportable sa mga Marcoses to be potentially the next president, but they like Sara Duterte. But you have also people like, for instance, Congressman Alvarez, na alam natin may hidwaan with Sara Duterte, na meron din silang competition, rivalry. So iba naman yung sa kanila. They really like completely another alternative. So maybe they're more comfortable with the Soto, Senator Soto and Leni Robredo kind of team up. So we see different kinds of defection happening. And then may mga ibang tao talaga siguro na ang basa nila, maybe it's a question of momentum. And just like in 2016, maybe Leni was a slow starter, but maybe she can significantly pick up towards the end. Ito lang sasabihin ko, what surveys cannot capture is yung actual number ng soft voters. So, I think to a certain degree, tama talaga yung surveys in terms of capturing overall momentum. Pero marami dyan sinasabi nila, second preference nila to or third preference nila to. But sa totoo lang, they can change their mind radically come election day. Marami dyan bandwagoners. No? I think, I won't be surprised up to 40% ng ating electorate could radically change their mind in the coming weeks and so. And again, this is not to be prejudicial to younger generation. Alam ko kami millennials, binabash parati na wala kaming sense of history and all. But let's not forget, there'll be 4 million Gen Z, no? Yung mga sobrang mga first-time voters na pumapasok and they're beginning to feel the field, they're beginning to feel ano yung politika natin. I think they're open. I think a lot of them are undecided. Maybe their preference now is this candidate, but I think they can radically change that depending on the performance of different candidates in the final stretch. But dito talaga, Luchi, nakikita natin na volunteers are making a big difference. Defections within the ranks of some of the big parties is making a big difference. And I believe the bandwagoners and new voters could also make a big difference in the coming weeks. No? Kaya hindi pa tapos ang laban. There's nothing definitive or predetermined about this. Speaking of bandwagon, let's not forget, Bongo Marcos was 13% and number 3 in the second quarter, of last year sa Pulse Asia, and then he jumps from 13 to 53, right? He's benefiting from bandwagon. But my point is the bandwagon can cut both ways. And a huge part of that bandwagon, Robbie and Lucci, was Mindanao. So for instance, if you look at some of the numbers, ang numbers na among Waray was higher than Tagalog, for instance, right? Who are more familiar, supposedly, or more friendly towards the Marcoses. And I think a lot of people in Mindanao, for instance, can still reconsider their options if people who are close to Sara may have a different preference for president. And I think a part of that also is yung legacy ng martial law, which was the darkest in actually Mindanao. If you look at it objectively, yung conflict na nangyari, yung mga abuso na nangyari, grabe. And as I said, BBM didn't do very well in 2016. So this is not a solid vote. It's a very soft vote, and it's a bandwagon vote so far preference, which pushed up BBM in the numbers. But bandwagon cuts both ways. It could also reverse. So ang challenge ngayon for other candidates, whether it's Isa of Isko or Rosa, for those who want Lenny, then the challenge is how to parang convert into voting preference, yung mga reservations that some politicians or folks have there in Mindanao. I think that's really the challenge. And the other thing I want to emphasize is this. There's also a sense that the vice presidential mates of Lenny and Isko perhaps are not strong enough. Therefore, they're pushing for Sara, who seems to have more of the stars aligned for her. So if you look at it, mukhang Sara actually has a much more solid base of support than Marcos in a way. But this is not surprising because Sara used to be the number one, right? Dun sa mga pre-election surveys. So I think this explains why Sara is the constant element, Isa, Rosa, Unity. But the presidential bet shifts is also because of the perceived weaknesses ng vice presidential mates ng ibang presidential candidates who may be comfortable with having Sara as their unofficial or indirect katandem. But then again, this also shows gaano ka ang gulo ng politika natin kasi wala talaga tayong real political parties. Unlike sa America, which is not necessarily the best country when it comes to democracy, but at least dyan, klaro yung ticket eh. Kung sino yung presidential candidate, may automatic na vice presidential candidate. Wala naman tayo dito, kaya dyan nangyayari yung horse trading. And next level yung horse trading nangyayari ngayon. But Sara seems to be the constant element in all of these crisscrossing realignments. So that tells you that I think a lot of politicians feel Sara has a much more solid base than the current front runner for the presidential race, for instance.
I want to take your take focusing on the developments in Mindanao over the weekend, particularly nangyari dito sa Misamis. Congresswoman Juliet Uy used to be really supporting the BBM, officially now shifting to Lenny, along with, if the reports are accurate, along with at least 11 incumbent mayoral candidates. Alongside that, you look at CDO, rival candidates, both endorsing. You have Oscar Moreno, you have Rufus Rodriguez. The Cagayan-Iligan corridor, we keep referring to Mindanao. Every time we talk about Mindanao, we look at Davao, and we look at the Dutertes, and so on. And then all of a sudden this weekend, let's not forget the Cagayan-Iligan corridor, diba? And these major cities. What do you see happening in Mindanao?
Well, dito rin nakikita natin na within the so-called solid South, there are actually internal rivalries and all. We already saw that a little bit with Alvarez and Sara back in the day. I mean, the Hukbong and all of that movement, I think, created this impression na very coherent yung solid South movement. But I think Mindanao overall is solidly behind the Dutertes. So Sara, that's why I think she can hold on to her very strong numbers in Mindanao. But clearly, yung mga internal divisions na meron sa Mindanao na hindi natin nakikita masyado in 2019 elections ay lumalabas ngayon pagdating sa alignments for the presidential candidates. And you're absolutely right. We tend to think a lot about Davao kind of as the representation of Mindanao politics. But actually, you have other centers of power and other political families and figures na hindi named Duterte. So I think this is something that we're doing. Kaya para sa akin, 2019 and 2022 is a crash course on Mindanao politics. I won't pretend to be a knowledgeable person on the nitty-gritties of Mindanao politics, pero base sa my visits to Mindanao, my talks at Ateneo de Davao, and my interaction with people on the ground, grabe, very fluid then on the ground. But as I said, it looks like those fragmentation are not hurting Sara, but they could hurt the current front runner for the presidential run. That's why I think some people, the more pragmatist or realpolitik people, whether in the Isko camp, in the Lenny camp, etc., are thinking, why not we do some crossover here? Maybe that can help us to push up our numbers in Mindanao. Kasi ang baba na numbers ni Isko and Lenny, I mean, we're in single digits while Bongbong Marcos is like 70% or more than 70%. But yun nga, a lot of that is soft. A lot of that can actually fragment for the presidential race. And for us, we're beginning to learn more and more also about Mindanao politics. But the last thing I want to emphasize this is here. I think if President Duterte endorsed BBM, I don't think mangyayari yung ganito So I think a lot of them na-sense nila that President Duterte might have other preferences. So I think they're trying to guess that, or it makes them feel comfortable enough not to fully endorse the whole unit team.
But
So
you
yung
have Sara.
pag-vaccinate
President
na,
Duterte came out and said, BBM ako, medyo malabo para sa akin na all of it, we'll see this level of fragmentation. Yun lang sense ko Kasi may division din within the House of Duterte, di ba?
Yes, sir.
So I think that
Yes,
is
sir.
what also other Mindanao political figures are
But
sensing.
Sara is the candidate, and we know who Sara is friends with. Sara is a very good friend of Amy Marcos. And the president is not a candidate himself. So, hindi ba maitatawid ni Sara na si Bongbong ang suporta ng Mindanao?